So this is not true for sex workers. Sex itself, and hence women's bodies, in total become commodities. And this presents a great problem because it raises a second fundamental point, namely the issue of ownership and control. So if the bodies of sex workers are themselves commodities, in other words, they don't have a use value, exchange value, the counter-argument to the issue is ownership and control. Now, there is a counter-argument to what I've just said, and this is presented again by Gregor Gall, and in fact, he specifically replied to this point that I made in a letter that he wrote to a Morning Star, and he said that if I was right, this would be tantamount to voluntary slavery. If I saw that the bodies of women as commodities, this would be tantamount to voluntary slavery if such a thing could exist. The only situation which the selling of bodies, people, takes place is between traffickers, but that concerns forced and bonded labour. And then he goes on to say, and I have to quote him, what sex workers sell is their willingness to perform sexual acts, and it is in this sense that they sell their labour. I don't know what that means. Their ability to perform erotic, emotional, mental and physical labour involved in the array of activities that constitute sex work, not just prostitution. Well, that is stupid nonsense, because what he's doing, I mean, this is a specious argument, somehow by sleight of hand, it separates sex work from women's bodies. How can you do that? It doesn't mean anything. So he's saying that what sex workers sell is their willingness to perform a sexual act. So is that willingness to perform a sexual act, is that labour power, commodity? What is it? So I don't follow it, and if somebody in this room can follow it and tell me that I've got it all wrong and Gregor Gall in fact is a genius, then I'm happy to go along. Well, I'm not happy to go along with him, but this is obviously wrong. He writes an internet piece for the Australian Strippers Union, in which he argues that the or theoretical justification, when he says that the conceptual fulcrum, as he puts it, for organising sex work is the discourse or perspective of viewing sex workers as workers whose labour, whether emotional or erotic, is deemed to have two qualities. Yeah, well, firstly, that it is of a sufficient level of moral legitimacy, and secondly, it has a social worth as a form of employment. We don't use these arguments when we're talking about workers selling their labour power, do we? Worker on a building site has got a social worth, and that's not those. Don't argue about those two qualities. He's made all this up because he's not a Marxist, and we should recognise that, I think. He says also that sex work is viewed as work comprising work that can be socially useful and can provide job satisfaction and personal fulfilment. Well, what about if you're trafficked? What about if you're a child? How can that give you job satisfaction? And later on I'll give you some statistics about trafficked women. You know, I mean, this is, he's wanting to see, what he's done is he's gone to all these sex clubs like the Australian one, and he's seen these women who have made sex work a life choice, fine, but that's not the majority of women. I mean, far from it, as we know. Now, if you compare it to Poulin's analysis, the man that I mentioned right at the beginning, he says that the increasing size and centrality of the global sex industry helps to explain why so many groups and agencies are adopting normalising regulatory approaches. In other words, they're making it all look as though it is okay, a bit like that ILO quote I gave you earlier on. The rapidly expanding international sex market exploits above all women and children, especially members of marginal and minority groups in the third world and in the former socialist countries. And I don't think they have much of a choice. These women are totally exploited. Some of them are bonded labour, actually. In other words, the Gall approach, and that of the International Union of Sex Workers, is to normalise the sex industry and even allow those who control it to be advocate for greater legal controls. Thus, the International Union of Sex Workers goes so far as to have the bosses of the sex industry, the so-called good providers of the sex trade, as leading spokespeople of the trade union. And you only need to look at the GMB website and you'll see Douglas Fox, owner of the Christiany Companions Export Agency, one of the largest export, did I say export? I meant escort agency, as is also a leading figure in the International Union of Sex Workers and the GMB. I mean, that is unbelievable in my book. I mean, we have bosses sponsoring unions, but bosses who are just sleazebags. I mean, total sleazebags. Anyway, to go on, to whom do women sell sex work? Well, the sanitised, libertarian English Collective of Prostitutes and International Union of Sex Workers view is that women are or can be in control of the transaction, especially if they weren't to be harassed by the police and were instead protected by the law. These organisations see the decision to enter the sex industry as a logical extension of women's right to choose, or the women's right to choose slogan, which we had, or the women's liberation movement had in the 1960s. Why shouldn't women be permitted to use their bodies in any way they want and get paid for it into the bargain? But I think that this conveniently overlooks the fact that the sex industry is big business controlled by men who make vast profits from it. And if we can't, I mean, do you know, in Soho there's 3,600 brothels. They're not controlled by the women, they're controlled by, you know, rapacious capitalists, actually. This is this huge industry. Although men are sometimes exploited in the sex trade, we should not forget, as a woman researcher who works actually at the Child and Women Advice Unit at London Metropolitan University, argues that prostitution is about men's sexuality, not women's. Without men's demand for prostitute women, there would be no such women. I think also the freedom of choice arguments breaks down when we consider the undeniable links between the trafficking of women and children and prostitution, which has shown a marked increase in countries like the Netherlands, where the industry is legal. A study undertaken by London Metropolitan University in 2004, commissioned by the Scottish Government, demonstrated that the sex industry had augmented, as has violence against prostituted people. And this has, quote, increased markedly in all the countries that have liberalised their prostitution laws and turned pimps into respectable businessmen. In addition, in the UK, the free choice argument is further dispelled when we note that 3 out of 4 women in prostitution become involved aged 21 or younger. It's real free choice, that is. And 1 in 2, 18 or younger. Based on a study of Hull, Manchester, Kirklees and London, 87% of women in street-based prostitution used heroin. Hardly a free choice argument. I mean, unless we face these facts, we are going to come to a stupid libertarian position which doesn't do justice to the real issues. I think also we have to, as communists and Marxists, place the argument within a wider context of understanding women, class, oppression and exploitation. Now, I'm sure everybody's read that pamphlet, but oppression although it might take the form of discriminating against the oppressed, stands in a unique relationship to class society. Oppression is the most important. Isn't just discrimination. It's the most important means of maintaining the class relations which support capitalism, and as such, oppression is a function of class society as well as being a product of it. This is because oppression is linked materially to the process of class exploitation, as well as operating at a superstructural level through oppressive ideologies. It's very evident that the oppressed are an explicit category, and we need now to look at the way in which oppression operates at these two levels. Firstly, at the material level, the fact of oppression is responsible for the super-exploitation, particularly of women, but also of black people. I say that because we have to question the fact as to why it is that women have historically always received lower pay and still do. I mean, if we don't look at that, and we don't understand why it is that women have always been like the subservient people, and if you look at literature you can see, I mean, it's not just the Taliban who were cruel to women. I mean, in this country, wives' tales were going on in the 19th century. Engels puts it, I think, in a beautiful little phrase in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, when he says that in the family, the man, and he's talking about the working class family, the man is the bourgeois, the wife the proletarian. In other words, ordered about. And, the whole marriage vows, will you love or obey? They never asked the man if he'd obey his wife. It was always, I know it's changed a bit now, and we've got this stupid wedding thing. So, basically, all indices of wage rates nationally and internationally show that the wages of women and black people, for that matter, are lower than that of white males. And this, of course, operates to the material advantage of the owners of the means of production, the capitalists. I mean, it's not only under capitalism, but we'll just use capitalism as an example. And that's why, again, Marx talks in Volume 1 of Capital that despite the conventional morality about the sanctity of family life and the key role of women within it, the labour of women was often preferred to that of men because it attracts lower wages. So in the early, women, by the way, were the first proletarians. They were the first people in the cotton factories. You never taught this at school, it's just not. Anyway, so there's I